Every stone at Stonehenge is a crime scene, not because of ancient sacrifices or mystical rituals, because someone stole the credit. For centuries, we've been told that Druids built this monument. But here's the problem. Druids didn't exist when Stonehenge was constructed. They wouldn't appear in Britain for another 1,000 years. The real builders were farming families living in wooden houses, grinding grain by hand, surviving harsh winters on stored food. Yet these simple people organized a logistics network spanning half of Britain. They moved 40-ton stones across hundreds of kilometers. They created precision joints that still hold after 5 millennia. The truth about these forgotten engineers will completely change how you see prehistoric intelligence. Watch until the end, and you'll realize everything you think you know about who built Stonehenge is wrong. Transport yourself to the Salisbury Plain around 3000 BC. This isn't the manicured tourist site you might imagine. It's a windswept grassland dotted with scattered farming settlements, each home to maybe 30 or 40 people living in simple wooden houses with thatched roofs. The biggest tools these communities possess are antler picks, wooden sledges, and stone axes that take days to shape properly. These aren't the mysterious, robed figures of popular imagination. These are people who wake before dawn to milk their cattle, who spend their days grinding grain and tending small fields of wheat and barley. Their hands are calloused from working wood and stone. Their backs ache from hauling water and lifting harvested crops. When winter comes, they survive on stored grain and the meat from carefully managed herds of pigs and sheep. Yet somehow, these ordinary farming families looked at 40-ton blocks of stone and said, "We can move those." They stared across 25 kilometers of rough terrain and dense forest to the Marlborough Downs, where massive sarsen stones lay scattered like sleeping giants, and they made a decision that defies everything we understand about prehistoric capabilities. The stakes couldn't have been higher. Moving stones of this size without modern machinery means coordinating hundreds of people for months at a time. It means pulling farmers away from their harvests, risking food shortages, and investing enormous community resources in a project with no guaranteed outcome. One broken rope, one collapsed sledge, one miscalculation about leverage or weight distribution, and people could die, families could starve. Think about the planning required. You need teams to cut down forests and shape the timber for sledges and rollers. You need specialists to braid ropes strong enough to haul multi-ton loads. You need scouts to map routes across rivers and valleys. You need organizers to coordinate food and shelter for work crews that might number in the hundreds. And that was just for the local stones. The smaller blue stones, those haunting blue-grey pillars that form Stonehenge's inner circle, came from the Preseli Mountains in West Wales. That's over 200 kilometers away, across rivers, marshes, and dense woodland that would challenge even a modern hiking expedition. How does a scattered collection of farming villages, with no written language, no centralized government, no wheeled vehicles, and no domesticated horses, pull off the logistical equivalent of building a medieval cathedral? What was so important that ordinary people were willing to risk everything to drag stones across half of Britain? The answer lies buried in their bones, literally. When archaeologists extract ancient DNA from the teeth and bones found around Stonehenge, they're reading a genetic story written in our ancestors' cells. And that story reveals something extraordinary about who these builders really were. These weren't the indigenous hunter-gatherers who had lived in Britain for thousands of years. The real Stonehenge builders were descendants of farming communities that had migrated from the Mediterranean and continental Europe, bringing with them revolutionary new technologies, agriculture, pottery, and most importantly, the organizational skills needed to feed large groups of people in one place. Think of it like this. Imagine you're trying to coordinate a massive construction project, but everyone involved has to spend most of their time hunting deer and gathering berries just to survive. It's nearly impossible. But if you can grow wheat and barley, if you can domesticate cattle and pigs, suddenly you can feed hundreds of people in one location for extended periods. Agriculture wasn't just about food, it was the foundation of complex cooperation. The genetic evidence shows these farming communities had been established in Britain for over 1,000 years before Stonehenge's main construction phase began around 2500 BC. They'd had time to spread across the landscape, establish trade networks, and develop the sophisticated social structures needed for massive communal projects. But here's where it gets really interesting. Chemical analysis of teeth and bones from people buried at Stonehenge reveals that many of them didn't grow up locally. The isotope signatures in their dental enamel, chemical fingerprints laid down during childhood, match the geology of West Wales, Scotland, and other distant regions of Britain. This means Stonehenge wasn't built by a single local community. It was a truly national project, drawing people from across the British Isles. Imagine the coordination required. Families from Wales had to plan months-long journeys, bringing not just themselves but tools, food, and expertise. Communities hundreds of kilometers apart had to synchronize their agricultural calendars, ensuring they could spare workers during crucial construction periods. The animal bones scattered around the monument tell the same story. Pigs brought for ritual feasts show isotope signatures from all over Britain. This wasn't just a construction site, it was the prehistoric equivalent of a massive festival, bringing together communities that might otherwise never interact. These farming families had created something unprecedented in human history. A continent-spanning logistics network operating entirely through word of mouth, seasonal gatherings, and shared cultural practices. No kings, no written orders, no government bureaucracy, just ordinary people coordinating extraordinary collective action. But the logistical achievement was only the beginning. The engineering techniques these farmers developed to move and position the stones reveal a level of sophistication that makes modern construction crews take notice. Consider the Sarsen trilithons, those massive doorway-like structures where two uprights support a horizontal lintel stone. Each lintel weighs around 10 tons and had to be raised 15 feet off the ground with millimeter precision. The vertical stones were shaped with subtle bulges called entasis, the same optical illusion technique used in Greek temples centuries later, designed to make the pillars appear perfectly straight when viewed from below. Even more remarkable, the builders carved intricate joint systems into the stones. The lintels have circular depressions on their undersides that fit precisely over knobs carved into the uprights, a technique called mortise and tenon that carpenters still use today. Adjacent lintels are connected with tongue and groove joints, ensuring the entire circle remains stable even if individual stones shift over time. This isn't crude stacking. This is precision engineering executed with stone tools and an understanding of structural mechanics that wouldn't look out of place in a modern engineering textbook. These farmers had somehow developed techniques for measuring angles, calculating load distributions, and creating joints strong enough to support 10-ton stones for 5,000 years. Archaeological experiments have revealed even more sophisticated techniques. To raise the lintels, the builders likely used a combination of timber ramps and lever systems, slowly lifting each stone using coordinated teams that had to work in perfect synchronization. One mistimed movement could send a 10-ton block crashing down, destroying months of work and potentially killing workers. What we've lost is perhaps even more striking than what they achieved. These communities managed massive construction projects without any of the technologies we consider essential. No written project plans, no mathematical calculations we can recognize, no standardized measurement systems, no mechanical devices beyond basic levers and inclined planes. Yet somehow they succeeded where modern attempts often fail. Contemporary efforts to recreate Stonehenge using only prehistoric techniques have repeatedly run into problems that the original builders solved effortlessly. Modern teams with detailed engineering knowledge, computer modeling, and coordinated equipment still struggle to move stones of this size across rough terrain without damaging them. But this wasn't the most shocking part. The DNA evidence reveals something that completely reframes the Stonehenge story. Around 2500 BC, right when the monument was reaching its final form, a new wave of people arrived in Britain from continental Europe. Within a few centuries, they had replaced up to 90% of the existing population. These newcomers brought metal tools, different pottery styles, and burial practices that archaeologists call the beaker culture. They didn't build Stonehenge's main structure, but they inherited it, modified it, and used it for their own ceremonies for over 1,000 years. Stonehenge wasn't built by a single culture at all. It's the product of multiple communities across centuries, each adding their own touches to a monument that had already become ancient by their time. The people who conceived and began Stonehenge were largely gone by the time it was finished. The monument we see today represents one of the most dramatic population turnovers in European prehistory, yet the new arrivals continued the project as if it were their own sacred inheritance. This changes everything we thought we knew about prehistoric Britain. This revelation about Stonehenge carries profound implications for how we understand large-scale cooperation in our own rapidly changing world. These ancient communities achieved something that modern organizations struggle with daily: coordinating complex projects across cultural boundaries, generational changes, and technological transitions. Today's infrastructure projects often fail precisely where Stonehenge succeeded. The Berlin-Brandenburg Airport took 14 years to build and went billions over budget due to coordination failures between different contractors and changing technical standards. California's high-speed rail project has been plagued by conflicts between local communities, state agencies, and federal regulators. The original World Trade Center rebuilding involved so many competing stakeholders that basic decisions took years to resolve. Yet somehow, 5,000 years ago, farming communities with no written communication system managed to coordinate a construction project that lasted over 15 centuries and survived a complete population replacement. They created something so culturally important that incoming peoples adopted it as their own rather than abandoning it for their familiar traditions. The implications for climate adaptation are particularly striking. As sea levels rise and weather patterns shift, we'll need exactly the kind of long-term, multi-generational cooperation that Stonehenge represents. Current climate infrastructure projects, seawalls, flood barriers, drought-resistant agriculture require coordination across decades and between communities that may have very different immediate priorities. The Stonehenge builders somehow solved the free rider problem that plagues modern collective action. Every community that contributed labor and resources to the monument could have saved effort by letting others do the work, then showing up to benefit from the finished product. Yet, the project continued for centuries, suggesting they developed social mechanisms for ensuring sustained, voluntary cooperation. Archaeological evidence indicates they achieved this through what we might recognize as festival-based governance. The massive feasts held at Stonehenge, with pigs brought from across Britain, created regular opportunities for far-flung communities to meet, share information, resolve disputes, and coordinate future projects. These weren't just religious ceremonies, they were prehistoric conferences where practical decisions got made through face-to-face negotiation. Modern climate negotiations often fail because they rely on abstract commitments made by distant representatives. The Stonehenge model suggests that sustained cooperation requires regular, personal contact between the people who will actually implement agreements. When communities meet annually to feast together and work on shared projects, they develop the trust relationships that make long-term cooperation possible. The engineering lessons are equally relevant. As our own infrastructure ages and climate stresses intensify, we need construction techniques that can adapt to changing conditions without requiring complete rebuilding. Stonehenge's modular design, individual stones that can be repositioned, joints that allow controlled movement, structures that remain stable even if individual elements fail, but offers a model for resilient construction that remains functional across centuries of change. Have you ever been part of a project that lasted longer than the people who started it? Maybe a community garden that outlived its founders, or a family business passed down through generations, or even a neighborhood tradition that continued when the original organizers moved away. The Stonehenge story raises fascinating questions about how we create things meant to outlast ourselves. What makes some projects survive major disruptions while others collapse at the first sign of change? In your experience, what's the difference between short-term cooperation and the kind of sustained commitment that can span generations? The farmers who built Stonehenge solved problems we're still grappling with today: how to coordinate massive projects across diverse communities, how to create structures that adapt to changing circumstances, and how to build something so meaningful that even newcomers will preserve it. They did it without governments, without written plans, and without any of the technologies we consider essential for large-scale organization. But here's the question that keeps archaeologists awake at night. If these farming communities could achieve such sophisticated cooperation 5,000 years ago, what happened to those skills? Why do modern societies, with all our communication technologies and organizational tools, struggle with exactly the challenges they mastered? That's a mystery worth exploring next. If this kind of hidden history interests you, consider subscribing for more stories about the engineering genius hiding in our past.